15 years had passed since that terrible day, and the man who walked into the Desert Ridge Cantina barely resembled the boy who had hidden behind storage containers, and Daniel Whitman had grown tall and lean, and his face was weathered by exposure to a dozen different worlds, and his eyes once bright with childish hope now carried the cold calculation of a survivor. And he wore a long duster coat that had seen better days with fabric reinforced by patches from various stations and outposts, and beneath it an arsenal of weapons hung with practiced ease, and there was a plasma pistol on his hip, and a kinetic rifle across his back, and various smaller tools of the trade tucked into custom holsters. But it was the knife at his side that drew the most attention because it was fashioned in an ancient style reminiscent of the blades once carried by Apache warriors on old Earth, and the cantina fell quiet as Daniel entered, because Desert Ridge had changed in 15 years, and the Zarkan raid had been followed by others, and the settlement had adapted and grown harder, and walls had gone up and automated defenses ringed the perimeter, and the innocence was gone and replaced by hard-earned wariness. And Martha Green was now running the cantina her father had built, and she recognized Daniel first, and her eyes widened, and then narrowed because Daniel the boy was a memory, but this man was something else entirely. And she said his name quietly and said that folks had said he was dead, and Daniel replied that they were almost right several times, and his voice was rough, like he did not use it much, and he said he needed information about Zarkan operations in this sector, and the few patrons in the bar exchanged glances because asking about the Zarkan was not healthy and the syndicate had long memories and longer reach, but there was something about the way Daniel asked, and it was not a request, but a statement of intent, and it made people nervous in a different way. And old Pete Morrison spoke up from his corner table, and the man had lost 3 sons in the raids, and he asked if Daniel was hunting slavers, because if he was, there were plenty of folks who would point him in the right direction, for the right reasons. And Daniel turned to face him, and Pete saw something in those eyes that made him sit back, because this was not just another bounty hunter or revenge seeker, and this was a man who had spent 15 years learning how to hurt. The people who had hurt him and Daniel said softly that he was not hunting but waging war, and that he was one man maybe. But he had learned from the best, and that humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy, and not the fastest or the smartest, but they were the most stubborn, and they never forgot, and the Zarkan had taken something from him 15 years ago, and he had spent every day since learning how to take it back, and Martha set a drink in front of him without charging, and it was a gesture of respect or pity, and Daniel could not tell which, and maybe it was both, and she asked quietly if he was still looking for his father John. And Daniel said he had found him 3 years ago at a mining operation in the outer reaches, but his father had not survived the rescue attempt, and his voice did not waver. But his hand tightened on the glass, and he said it took him 2 years after that to verify which Zarkan commander had ordered the raid on Desert Ridge, and another year to track his operations, and now he was here because that commander's operation had grown, and he was not just hitting frontier colonies anymore, but going after established settlements and bigger prizes and more people, and the room had gone completely silent now because everyone knew what that meant, and Desert Ridge rebuilt and fortified was still vulnerable and still a target. And Pete asked when they would come, and Daniel said 3 days, maybe 4, because the commander moved methodically now and had learned from his mistakes, which meant he would hit harder than last time. And Martha leaned forward and asked if Daniel had come to warn them, and his smile was cold and sharp, and he said he had come to use them as bait, because the commander's name was Thrakzul, and he thought humans were weak and scattered and easy prey, and Daniel was going to teach him different, but he needed their help, and the settlers looked at each other with fear and excitement mixing in their eyes because they had lived under the threat of raids for so long, and the idea of fighting back and of turning the tables was both terrifying and intoxicating. And Daniel began to explain his plan, and he spoke with the authority of someone who had studied his enemy for years and who knew exactly how Zarkan raiders operated and what their weaknesses were. And he told them that the Zarkan thought they understood humans, but they did not, and they saw humans as soft and emotional and disorganized, and they were not entirely wrong, but what the Zarkan did not understand was that these things made humans dangerous, not weak. And every person they had taken, and every family they had broken, created someone like Daniel, and eventually, someone like that did not just run or hide but fought back. And as Daniel spoke, the settlers began to realize that this was their chance, and this was their moment to stop being victims and to start being survivors. And Martha looked at the man who had once been little Danny Whitman, and she saw someone who had been forged by pain and loss into something harder than steel. And she wondered if there was anything left of that boy inside. But then she saw the way his hand trembled slightly when he mentioned his father, and she knew that the boy was still there, buried deep, but still there and still hurting. And Pete asked what happened after, even if they won, because the syndicate would send more. And Daniel's response was chilling in its simplicity, and he said then he would kill more, and that Thraxul was the commander. But he answered to others, and this was not about saving just Desert Ridge, but about sending a message to every Zarkon raider in the frontier. And the message was that humans remembered, and humans took revenge, and humans never ever gave up. And as the sun set that evening, Daniel stood on the old communications tower and looked out at the settlement, and somewhere up in those stars, Thraxul was coming, and Daniel Whitman was ready, and the lone Apache was about to teach the Zarkon Syndicate a lesson they would never forget. The mining colony of Desert Ridge sat on the edge of the Kepler frontier like a forgotten outpost in an ocean of red dust, and it was not much to look at, but the people who lived there called it home, and that was enough for them. And the settlement consisted of prefab habitats and extraction equipment scattered across endless plains that stretched toward distant Crimson Mountains, and most travelers from the core worlds would not have given it a second glance. But to 10-year-old Danny Whitman, it was the entire universe, and he ran through the main street with his worn boots kicking up clouds of rust-colored dust, because his father, John Whitman, was due back from the northern mining site any minute now, and Danny had promised to meet him at the landing pad. And the boy's heart was full of excitement because his father always brought back stories from the deep mines, and sometimes small crystals that glowed faintly in the dark. And Danny loved those moments when his father would ruffle his hair and tell him about the strange rock formations they had discovered that day. But something felt wrong today, and the sky, which was usually empty except for the occasional cargo hauler, was suddenly filled with ships, and they were not the familiar vessels that belonged to any human corporation Danny recognized, and instead they were sleek, angular things that descended like birds of prey, with hulls that gleamed with an oily sheen that made the boy's stomach turn, and he stopped running and ducked behind a storage container because some instinct told him to hide, and that instinct probably saved his life. And the Zarkon Syndicate had come to Desert Ridge, and Danny watched from his hiding spot as armored figures emerged from the ships, and they were not like the peaceful Verdani traders who sometimes visited the settlement, or even the gruff Krell mercenaries who occasionally passed through. And these were Zarkon raiders, and their chitinous armor reflected the settlement lights in strange, unsettling patterns, and they moved with predatory efficiency, and their weapons were already drawn and scanning for targets, and the colonists did not stand a chance because the handful of security personnel were overwhelmed in seconds, and families were herded into the town square like cattle, and the Zarkon began their selection process with cold, mechanical precision, and they were not interested in the settlement's resources or territory because what they wanted was people, and specifically they wanted workers for their deep space mining operations in locations so remote and dangerous that only slave labor made them profitable. And Danny's heart hammered in his chest as he saw his father dragged from the northern landing pad's transport, and John Whitman fought against his captors with everything he had. But a Zarkon stunner put him on his knees, and the boy wanted to run and help. But his father's eyes found him across the chaos, and the message in those eyes was clear, and it said, "Stay hidden and stay alive." And Danny pressed himself further behind the storage container as tears streamed down his face, and the Zarkon loaded their captives onto transport ships with brutal efficiency, and families were separated without ceremony, and people who had lived on Desert Ridge for generations were cataloged like cargo and processed like goods to be shipped, and then with the same speed they had arrived, the raiders departed, and their ships lifted into the atmosphere and disappeared into the sky, and they left behind empty homes and shattered lives and a settlement that would never be the same. And Danny emerged from his hiding spot when the last ship's engines faded to silence, and the settlement was quiet now in a way that felt wrong and eerie, and those who remained were the old and the very young and the broken, and Governor Martinez stood in the square with her face pale and drawn, and she was trying to maintain some semblance of order. But her voice shook as she spoke, and Danny was not listening to her words about contacting the colonial authority or waiting for help, because none of that mattered to him. And instead, he was looking at the sky and at the direction the ships had gone, and he was burning that trajectory into his memory with an intensity that surprised him. And his father was up there somewhere in one of those ships, and Danny made a silent promise to the empty sky and to his father and to himself, and the promise was simple and absolute. And it was that he would find his father no matter how long it took, and no matter what he had to do, and no matter who he had to become. And the other survivors moved around him in a daze, and they were trying to process what had happened and trying to understand how their safe little world had been shattered in minutes. But Danny understood something they did not, and he understood that the galaxy was not a safe place, and that humans were not as protected as they thought, and that sometimes the monsters were real and they came from the stars. And as the sun set over Desert Ridge that day, painting the red landscape in shades of blood and fire, Danny Whitman stopped, being a child, and something harder and colder began to grow in his heart, and it was a seed that would take 15 years to fully mature. But when it did, the Zarkon Syndicate would learn that they had made a terrible mistake, and they would learn that humans were not the easy prey they assumed, and they would learn that some debts can never be forgiven, and some promises can never be broken. And young Danny stood there in the fading light with his fists clenched and his jaw set, and he did not know it yet, but he was already becoming the man who would one day be known across the frontier as the lone Apache, and he was becoming the nightmare that would haunt Zarkon commanders, and the legend that would give hope to countless settlements. And all of it started here in this moment with a boy who refused to accept that his father was gone forever, and who refused to be a victim, and who refused to let the monsters win. They came at dawn just as Daniel had predicted, and Zarkon raiders preferred attacking when their prey was still groggy and disorganized, and it had worked for them countless times across the frontier. But this time would be different. And 6 ships descended through the morning haze, and their sleek forms cut through the rust-colored sky, and they arranged themselves in the standard Zarkon attack pattern, with 4 positioned to herd civilians into the town square, while 2 hung back to intercept any escape attempts, and Daniel watched from his perch with his breathing steady. And around the settlement 60 settlers crouched in hidden positions with their hearts hammering, but their hands steady on weapons they had practiced with for 3 days, and it was not much training, but it would have to be enough. And the first Zarkon strike team deployed with practiced efficiency, and 20 raiders in full combat armor moved forward, and their chitinous plates gleamed with a sickly iridescence. And they moved in perfect formation with weapons scanning for threats, and behind them a larger transport ship began its descent, ready to load its human cargo. And Thraxul himself led the operation, and his command armor was more elaborate than his soldiers and marked with trophies from previous raids, and he strode into Desert Ridge like he owned it, and broadcast orders in the harsh, clicking language of his species. And to him, this was routine, and just another weak human settlement, and another profitable harvest of slaves, and the settlers played their part perfectly. And they emerged from their homes with hands raised and looking appropriately terrified, and the Zarkon herded them toward the square, just as they had 15 years. Ego and everything was proceeding exactly as Thraxul expected, and that is when Daniel gave the signal. And the mining charges hidden in the settlement's main street detonated in a carefully orchestrated sequence, and not all at once, which would have been wasteful, but in a cascading pattern designed to channel the Zarkon raiders into predetermined kill zones, and the explosions were not powerful enough to seriously damage the raiders' armor, but they were loud and disorienting, and, before the dust settled, the settlers opened fire. And it was not the panicked spray of terrified civilians, but calculated shots from covered positions, and Daniel had taught them to aim for joints in the Zarkon armor, and for the sensory organs on their heads, and for the exposed flesh at their necks, and human weapons might be less powerful than some alien technology. But they were accurate, and the settlers had been taught exactly where to aim. And the first 3 Zarkon went down in seconds, with their armor penetrated by concentrated fire, and the others scattered seeking cover and their perfect formation breaking. And this was not how raids were supposed to go, because humans did not fight back, and did not plan, and did not coordinate. And Thraxul roared orders trying to restore discipline to his shocked troops, and his species had raided human colonies for decades without serious resistance, and this was unprecedented. And then Daniel entered the fight, and he dropped from the communications tower with a grappling line, and landed behind the Zarkon position, and his rifle spoke once, twice, 3 times, and 3 more raiders fell, and the Zarkon turned to face this new threat, and that is when they got their first good look at him. And humans the Zarkon had learned were easy to read because they panicked and fled and begged, but this human did none of those things, and he moved through their position like death itself, with his weapons firing with mechanical precision, and his knife flashing when he closed to melee range, and his eyes, those cold human eyes, held no fear but only purpose. And one Zarkon raider managed to close with Daniel, and its superior strength and armored bulk were overwhelming, and it raised its weapon for a killing blow. But Daniel did not try to fight the creature's strength, and instead he ducked inside its reach, and his knife found the gap between helmet and chest plate, and the Zarkon's regenerative biology was impressive, but it could not regenerate from a severed spinal column, and the raider fell and Daniel kept moving. And Thraxul watched his disciplined raid dissolve into chaos. And this was not possible because one human, no matter how skilled, should not be able to turn the tide of battle, but Daniel was not fighting like a warrior, and he was fighting like a predator, and using the terrain and using the Zarkon's own expectations against them. And the commander made a decision, and he activated his personal communicator calling for reinforcements from the orbiting ships, and this settlement was more trouble than it was worth, and better to level it from orbit and move on. But Daniel had planned for that too, and as Thraxul reached for orbital support, his communicator crackled with unexpected static. And then came a voice speaking in perfect Zarkon dialect but with an unmistakably human accent, and the voice said that it was Captain Helen Morris of the human vessel Swift Retribution, and that his orbital assets were currently disabled, and his reinforcements were not coming, and that he was alone. And Thraxul's mandibles clicked in confusion and growing alarm, because the Swift Retribution was a legend among frontier humans, and it was a heavily modified corvette that had been harassing Zarkon operations for the past 2 years, and its captain was considered a terrorist by the Syndicate and a hero by human colonists. But how did she know to be here and now? And the answer was simple, because Daniel had called her 3 days ago using the communication equipment he had brought with him, and he had sent a message to contacts in the colonial frontier, and the message was straightforward, and it said Thraxul would be at Desert Ridge on this date and to come prepared, and Captain Morris had jumped at the chance. And on the ground the battle had shifted decisively, and the Zarkon raiders realized they had no support and no escape, and they fought with the desperation of cornered animals, but desperation was not enough against preparation, and the settlers, following Daniel's training, maintained their discipline, and they did not try to be heroes, and they held their positions and covered each other and let the Zarkon wear themselves out against carefully prepared defenses. And Daniel himself moved through the battlefield like a surgeon who was precise and efficient, and he was not the strongest fighter or the fastest, but he understood violence in a way that came from hard experience, and every movement conserved energy, and every shot counted, and every decision was calculated for maximum effect. The next 3 days transformed Desert Ridge into something between a fortress and a trap, and Daniel worked with a focused intensity that bordered on obsessive, and he drew on knowledge he had accumulated across dozens of battlefields and covert operations, and Governor Martinez initially resisted the idea because she wanted to evacuate and to call for colonial authority support and to do anything except deliberately invite an attack. But Daniel had learned patience along with violence, and he laid out the reality with brutal honesty. And he told her that the colonial authority would not get there in time because they never did for frontier worlds, and that evacuation meant abandoning their homes and letting Thraxul move on to the next target, and that he would just keep hunting humans until someone stopped him, and that someone was Daniel. But he needed time, and he needed Thraxul's attention focused here. And what finally convinced her was not his logic, but his arsenal, because Daniel had spent 15 years not just learning to fight, but acquiring the tools to do it effectively, and from a hidden cache outside the settlement. He brought weapons that made the governor's security chief whistle in appreciation, and it was human military hardware mostly, but modified with technology traded from a dozen different species. And Daniel explained as he set up the first defensive position that humans did not have the natural advantages of other races, and that Zarkon had armored exoskeletons and regenerative biology, and Krell were stronger and more resilient, and Verdani had psychic coordination, but humans innovated and adapted, and took what worked from everyone else and made it better, and he taught the settlers to rig the settlement's infrastructure with surprises, and mining explosives normally used for breaking rock were carefully placed to create kill zones, and the settlement's water system became a network for chemical agents that would disorient Zarkon sensory organs without harming humans, and even the dust itself that ever present red powder was weaponized with microscopic abrasives that would clog Zarkon breathing filters, but the real genius was in the psychology, because Daniel had studied the Zarkon Syndicate extensively, and they were predators by nature and raiders by culture, and they respected strength and despised weakness, so he made Desert Ridge look like easy prey while secretly transforming it into a killing ground. And on the second night, Daniel told the assembled settlers about 60 remained, and they were the ones too stubborn or too invested to leave. And he said that the Zarkon thought they understood humans and saw them as soft and emotional and disorganized, and they were not entirely wrong, because humans were emotional and formed attachments and held grudges. But what the Zarkon did not understand was that these things made humans dangerous, not weak, and every person they had taken and every family they had broken created someone like Daniel, and eventually someone like that did not just run or hide but fought back. And Pete Morrison, who had become Daniel's unofficial second-in-command, asked the question everyone was thinking, and he wanted to know what happened after. And even if they won, the Syndicate would send more, and Daniel's response was chilling in its simplicity, and he said then he would kill more, and that Thraxul was the commander. But he answered to others, and this was not about saving just Desert Ridge, but about sending a message to every Zarkon raider in the frontier. And the message was that humans remembered and took revenge, and never ever gave up. And on the third day, Daniel positioned himself on the settlement's highest point, which was an old communications tower that gave him a clear view of the surrounding terrain, and he had taught the settlers everything he could, and now came the waiting, and Martha brought him food as the sun set, and it was painting the red landscape in shades of blood and fire, and she asked if he really thought they could do this. And Daniel said that humans had been underestimated for too long, and that the galaxy saw them as newcomers, who were weak and divided, but they had survived ice ages and world wars and had gone from caves to starships in a cosmic eye blink, and the Zarkon had forgotten something important, and that was that humans did not just survive but dominated, and they just had to remember how. And as night fell, Daniel checked his weapons one final time, and the knife at his side was forged in the style of his Apache ancestors, and it gleamed in the starlight, and his great-great-grandfather had carried a blade like it in the deserts of old Earth, and now on a desert world light. Years away, that tradition continued, and the Zarkon were coming, and Daniel Whitman was ready, and he had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and he had learned from every fight and every loss and every narrow escape, and he had studied Zarkon tactics until he knew them better than they knew themselves, and he had trained his body until it was a weapon, and his mind until it was sharp as any blade, and most importantly, he had learned to be patient and to wait for exactly the right moment. And that moment was coming soon, and down below in the settlement, the 60 settlers who had chosen to stay were in their positions, and they were scared, but determined, and they had families to protect and homes to defend, and Daniel had taught them that fear was not weakness, but a tool, and that the trick was not to eliminate fear, but to use it, and to channel it into focus and precision. And the night was quiet, except for the wind moving across the red plains, and somewhere up in those stars, Thraxul was preparing his raid, and he was confident and certain of victory because he had done this hundreds of times before, and humans always broke and always scattered and always fell, but this time would be different because this time the humans were ready, and this time they had Daniel Whitman, and this time the predator was about to become the prey. Before Daniel could respond, Governor Martinez approached with Pete Morrison, and the older man's arm was bandaged, but he was grinning like he had won a lottery, and he said they did it, and actually did it, and sent those bug-eyed slavers running, with their tails between their legs, but Martinez was more subdued and said they also lost 6 people, and good people, and their defenses were in shambles, and if the Zarkon came back next week, they would not survive, and Daniel assured her they would not come back next week because Thraxul needed to report and reorganize, and the Syndicate would debate how to respond, and that gave them at least a month, maybe 3, and Martinez demanded to know what happened then, and if they would fight them again and keep fighting until everyone there was dead, and she said she appreciated what Daniel did truly. But this could not be their life, and Morris stepped in and said that was what she was offering, and protection and training and a network of ships and fighters who could respond when raiders showed up. And she said Desert Ridge fought today because Daniel prepared them. And to imagine if every frontier settlement had that preparation. And imagine if the Zarkon knew that hitting any human colony meant facing organized resistance. And Daniel looked around at the settlement and at the people who had fought and bled to defend their home. And they were waiting for him to decide, he realized, and waiting to see what the lone Apache would do next. And he thought about his father, and about John Whitman, who had spent his life building a home on this harsh world, and about the 15 years Daniel had spent alone hunting and fighting and surviving, and about all the people still out there in Zarkon slave operations hoping for rescue that might never come. And he said finally that he would help, but on his terms, and that he was not joining anyone's organization and not taking orders or wearing a uniform, and he would train their people and share what he knew and coordinate when it made sense. But he kept his independence and kept moving, and Morris smiled and said she would not expect anything less from the lone Apache, and that was the deal then, and he would help them build a real defense network, and they would provide support when he needed it, and together they would make the Zarkon Syndicate regret ever hearing the word human. And they shook hands, sealing an alliance that would change the frontier, and Daniel did not know it yet, but this moment would become legendary. And it was the day the lone Apache agreed to teach others his methods, and the day humanity's scattered colonies began to unite in defense, and the day the Zarkon Syndicate learned that humans, when pushed too far, did not just fight back, but won. And 6 months after the battle at Desert Ridge, Daniel stood in a converted warehouse on the mining station of New Haven watching 24 settlers practice combat drills, and they moved with increasing confidence, applying the techniques he had spent weeks teaching them. And it was not perfect, but it was progress. And the Frontier Defense Network, as Morris had named it, had grown faster than anyone expected, and word spread quickly through the colonies about Desert Ridge's victory, and other settlements reached out desperate for training, and for hope, and for anything that might protect them from raiders. And Daniel found himself traveling constantly, moving from world to world teaching colonists how to defend themselves, and he did not try to turn them into soldiers because most colonists were miners and farmers and technicians, and they had lives and families and jobs, but he could teach them to recognize threats and to prepare defenses and to coordinate when danger arrived, and these were small things that added up to survival. And he told the New Haven group during their break that the key was not panicking, and that Zarkon raiders relied on fear and chaos, and they hit fast and grabbed who they could and left before organized resistance formed. And if the colonists could maintain discipline for just 10 minutes, just long enough to coordinate and fight back, most raiding parties would retreat because they were predators, and predators did not take unnecessary risks. And a young woman named Claire raised her hand and asked, what about when they did not retreat, and what if they decided their settlement was worth the fight? And Daniel said then they held them for 15 minutes instead of 10 because help was coming. And he nodded toward the observation deck where Morris was reviewing patrol schedules with other captains, and said the swift retribution was not alone anymore. And they had 6 ships now, with more joining every month, and someone was always within jump distance of a frontier colony, and if they held long enough, reinforcements would arrive. And it was true, and the network had acquired ships through a combination of purchase and donation, and in one memorable case capturing a Zarkon raider vessel and repurposing it, and each ship was crewed by volunteers, and many of them were former colonists who had lost homes or family to raiders, and they patrolled the frontier in rotating patterns, responding to distress calls and conducting strikes against known Zarkon operations. And the syndicate had noticed, and 3 months ago they had sent a formal complaint to the colonial authority claiming the network was engaging in piracy and terrorism, and the authorities' response had been carefully neutral and neither condemning nor endorsing the frontier vigilantes. And officially the network did not exist, but unofficially core system politicians were quietly relieved that someone was handling the frontier security problem they had been ignoring for years. And after the training session ended, Morris joined Daniel on the warehouse's exterior platform, and New Haven sprawled below them. And it was a collection of domes and tunnels carved into an asteroid, and 20,000 people called it home. and until recently they had been completely defenseless against raiders, and Morris said they got a report from the Kepler sector, and 3 Zarkon ships attacked a convoy heading to Jefferson Colony. But the convoy had hired escorts from their network, and 2 of their ships were there, and they drove off the raiders without losing a single transport. And Daniel studied the tactical readout and asked if there were no casualties on their side, and Morris said 3 wounded and none critical. And the Zarkon lost 1 ship destroyed and 1 crippled, and she said they were adapting too, and their raids were more cautious now, and they scouted longer and hit harder when they did attack and retreated faster, and they were not dealing with the same enemy they faced 6 months ago. An hour later, Daniel stood in the settlement's new council chamber alongside Morris and Martinez, and representatives from a dozen other frontier colonies, and on the main screen a Zarkon official appeared, and it was not Thraxul whom Daniel had humiliated at Desert Ridge but someone higher in the syndicate hierarchy, and the official announced he was Counselor Vexithara and represented the syndicate's diplomatic corps, and they wished to discuss a cessation of hostilities with human frontier colonies, and the room erupted in shocked murmurs because the Zarkon wanted to negotiate. And Daniel felt a cold satisfaction, because this was exactly what 2 years of coordinated resistance was supposed to achieve. And the syndicate had realized human colonies were no longer easy targets, and Morris asked what their terms were, and her voice was carefully neutral. And Vexthara said the syndicate acknowledged that continued conflict was unprofitable, and they proposed a formal treaty, and the syndicate would cease all raiding operations in designated human frontier space. And in exchange, humans would not interfere with syndicate operations in other sectors. And Daniel leaned forward and asked about the humans they had already taken, and the thousands of people in their slave operations, and Vexithara's mandibles clicked uncomfortably, and said that would be part of the negotiation, and perhaps a gradual release program, and perhaps financial compensation, and these details could be worked out. And Daniel's voice cut through the discussion, and he said no, and not gradual, and not maybe. And every human they held would be released immediately, and full reparations for families destroyed. And the syndicate would formally acknowledge that all human space was off limits forever. And the Zarkon counselor was silent for a long moment, and said those terms were extremely generous to humanity. And Morris interjected and said they were not generous, and they were the minimum for humans to not hunt them down. And the syndicate built its empire on raiding weak targets, and humans were not weak anymore. And they were organized and armed and really, really good at holding grudges. And she said, if the syndicate wanted peace, those were the terms. And Vexthara looked at Daniel specifically and said he was the one they called the lone Apache, and the human who had caused the syndicate considerable difficulty. And would he accept such terms? And Daniel thought about his father, and about John Whitman, who had died in a Zarkon slave operation, and about the 15 years he had spent hunting raiders, and about all the lives destroyed by the syndicate's greed. And he wanted to say no, and to demand more, and to keep fighting until every Zarkon involved in slavery was held accountable. But he also thought about the colonists he had trained, and the settlements he had helped defend, and the families that would sleep safely if this treaty held. And his personal war had grown into something bigger than revenge, and it had become about protection, and about building a frontier where humans could live without fear. And he said finally that he accepted on the condition that the syndicate understood this was not the end of human expansion and not them retreating, and they would keep growing and keep spreading through the frontier. And if the syndicate ever broke this treaty, the network would ensure they regretted it, and humans did not forget and never stopped. And Vexithara's image flickered with what might have been respect or fear, and said understood, and formal negotiations would begin within the week, and the syndicate would honor this agreement. And the connection closed, and for a moment the room was silent. And then cheering erupted, because 2 years of constant vigilance and of fighting and training and organizing had culminated in this, and the Zarkon syndicate backing down and acknowledging that humanity was no longer prey. And later, as celebrations continued across Desert Ridge, Daniel found himself alone on the edge of the settlement, looking out at the rust-colored plains. And this was where his father had worked, and where young Danny had hidden and watched his world burn, and it seemed like a lifetime ago. And Morris joined him carrying 2 bottles of the local whiskey, and said it was quite a day. And the lone Apache negotiates peace with the Zarkon syndicate, and they would be writing about this in the history books, and Daniel admitted he did not want peace and he wanted revenge, and he wanted every Zarkon involved in raiding to pay for what they did, and Morris said she knew, but he chose something better, and he chose to protect people instead of just punishing his enemies, and that took more strength than revenge, and they drank in silence, watching the settlement lights come on as night fell, and Desert Ridge glowed against the darkness, and it was a beacon of human determination and resilience. And Morris asked what now, and the syndicate was backing down, and the network was recognized, and the frontier was safer than it had been in decades. And what did the lone Apache do when the war was over? And Daniel smiled slightly and said the war was never over, and there were other threats out there and other predators who thought humans were easy targets, and the network needed to keep growing and keep training and keep watching, and someone needed to remind the galaxy that humanity did not survive by being weak or lucky, and they survived by being too stubborn to die and too dangerous to ignore. And he raised his bottle toward the stars and said it was for his pa, and for everyone who did not make it, and for everyone who would, because they decided to fight back. And Morris clinked her bottle against his and said to humanity, and the galaxy's most dangerous underdog. And as stars emerged in the darkening sky, Daniel Whitman stood on the world where his journey began, and he was no longer a boy hiding in fear, but a man who had changed the frontier forever, and the lone Apache had started as a promise to a dead father, and it had become a legend that inspired hope across dozens of worlds, and in the vastness of space, predators who once saw humans as prey were learning a new lesson, and the lesson was that humanity remembered, and humanity took revenge, and humanity never ever gave up. Daniel closed the hologram and said that was good, and that meant they were winning, and that an enemy that adapted was an enemy that had been hurt. And the Zarkon built their whole operation on hitting weak targets, and now there were no weak targets. And every colony had defenses, and every convoy had escorts, and they had to work harder for less profit. And Morris said carefully, there was another development, and that other species were watching, and the Verdani Trade Collective contacted her last week, and they were interested in supporting the network financially. And the Zarkon had been raiding their ships too, and they were impressed by how effectively humans had organized. And Daniel frowned and said they did not need outside control. And Morris said it was not control but support. And the Verdani did not want to run things, and they just wanted the frontier safer for their traders. And their credits could buy better ships and better equipment and better training facilities, and they could scale up significantly. And it was tempting because the network operated on a shoestring budget funded by grateful colonists, and the occasional salvage from defeated raiders and Verdani support could transform them from a scrappy resistance into a real military force, but it also meant complications and obligations and the kind of political entanglements Daniel had been avoiding his whole life, and Morris said to think about it, and she knew he preferred working alone and keeping things simple. But they had a chance here to build something that outlasted them and something that protected the frontier for the long term. And the lone Apache could not be everywhere, but a well-funded, well-organized defense network could. And Daniel looked out at New Haven, and at the thousands of lives protected by the training he had provided. And Morris was right, and his personal war against the Zarkon had evolved into something bigger, and something that mattered beyond his quest for revenge. And the question was whether he could let go enough to let it grow, or whether his need for independence would limit what the network could become. And he said finally, to set up a meeting with the Verdani, but make it clear the network stayed independent, and they would take their money and their equipment, but they made their own decisions about how to use them. And if they tried to control operations, the deal was off. And Morris grinned and said she knew he would see it that way. And the Verdani would agree because they were practical, and they just wanted results, and the network was the only one delivering. And as Daniel prepared to leave for his next training assignment, he reflected on how far things had come. And 6 months ago, he had been a lone hunter moving through the shadows and striking where he could, and now he was part of something larger, and something that was changing the balance of power on the frontier. And the Zarkon Syndicate had underestimated humanity for too long, and they had assumed humans were weak and scattered and easy prey, and they were learning slowly and painfully how wrong they had been. And Daniel Whitman, the lone Apache who had started it all with a promise to a dead father, was making sure they never forgot the lesson. And 2 years after Desert Ridge, Daniel returned to where it all began, and the settlement had changed dramatically, and the ramshackle prefab structures had been reinforced with military-grade materials and automated. Defense turrets ringed the perimeter, and a proper landing pad accommodated the network ships that rotated through on patrol. And Desert Ridge had become a fortress, and more importantly, it had become a symbol. And Martha Green met him at the cantina, which had also undergone renovations, and the old building was now a training center, where settlers from across the sector came to learn combat techniques and defensive strategies, and a holographic display on one wall tracked Zarkon activity across the frontier in real time. And it was part of the network's early warning system, and Martha said, "Look at him and the legend returns." And they got groups asking about him every week, and wanting to meet the lone Apache and wanting to hear stories about the man who started the resistance, and Daniel grimaced and said he was not comfortable with that. And the legend and the stories made it sound like he did this alone. And Desert Ridge held because everyone fought, and the network worked because captains like Morris and settlements like this committed to defending themselves. And Martha replied that was why the legend mattered, and not because he was some kind of superhero, but because he proved it was possible. And for 15 years the frontier lived in fear, and Zarkon raiders took who they wanted when they wanted. And then Daniel came back and said no more, and he showed people they could fight back. And that was what changed everything. And she pulled up a data slate and asked if he wanted to see the numbers, and in the 6 months before Desert Ridge, the Zarkon Syndicate conducted 43 raids on human settlements and took over 800 people. And in the last 6 months, they had attempted 19 raids and successfully captured fewer than 100, and their operations in this sector were barely profitable anymore. And the numbers were impressive, but Daniel knew they represented more than statistics, and each prevented capture was a family staying together and a person keeping their freedom and a life not destroyed by slavery. And Governor Martinez joined them, looking older but more confident than the last time Daniel had seen her. And she said they received word from the colonial authority last week, an official word through proper channels, and they were finally acknowledging the Zarkon threat and committing resources to frontier defense, and 3 patrol ships were being reassigned to their sector. And Daniel said it was about time, and only took them a few years and a grassroots defense network to notice the problem. And Martinez explained the network embarrassed them and showed that independent colonists could organize better defense than the official government, and the authority could not ignore that forever. And here was the interesting part, and they wanted to coordinate with the network, not replace it. And they were proposing a formal partnership, and Daniel exchanged glances with Martha because this was the kind of political entanglement he had been avoiding, but it also represented legitimacy and resources the network needed to be truly effective. And he asked what Morris thought, and Martinez said she was cautiously optimistic, and the authority was not trying to control operations, just coordinate and share intelligence and provide backup for major operations, and recognize network personnel as legitimate security forces, and it would make everything they did easier and more effective. And before Daniel could respond, the cantina's alert system chimed, and everyone's attention shifted to the holographic display, and a Zarkon ship had been detected entering the system, and not the usual raiding force, but a single vessel broadcasting a diplomatic code.